Davis Goins, and I am the president and CEO for the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce. And for the last 8 or 9 years, we have been participating in the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference. For the last 3 or 4 years, we've been talking about how we can help to create policy to build sustainability in our communities. And by our communities, I think you get it. Because we don't always get a lot of help. And so we've got to figure out ways in which we can do that together. And one of the important things that you're going to hear today is that we're not always on the same page in terms of how we get there. But we are willing to talk and to discuss those different ways in which we might reach that same goal. We're all here for the same reason. We all want to build and sustain the communities that we live in and work in and play in and cry in and teach in. We all want the same thing. Having said that, let me first begin by saying that although the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce is a great organization, it is a great organization, it would not be without the support of many of our sponsors. And I want to give a shout out to the sponsors who have helped us to put this on. SMUD, which is the Sacramento Municipal Utilities District. They keep our lights on. I want to thank them very much for the support that they've given us, not only this year, but in many years. To that point, they believe in sustainability, sustainable communities so much. You're going to hear a little bit more about that. But they have actually started a sustainable communities department where they are focused on nothing but building our communities. And I am just so proud of the fact that we're partners with them. So thank you, SMUD. I also want to thank Blue Shield, who has stepped up to the plate this year. Well, they've been with us for many years. No, I take that back. Blue Shield hasn't. Jamal has. So he's worn many hats, but he's been a partner of ours for many years. And this year he's with us and representing Blue Shield, who has become a partner of ours. So thank you so much, Jamal and Blue Shield. Without further ado, I'm going to give up the stage to those that have the answers to the questions that you may have. And also to let you know that towards the end of our presentation, we will be taking questions and answers. So take copious notes and have a really good time. I'm going to turn this over now to Mr. Jose Bodipo Memba, who is our SMUD representative, who's going to talk to you a little bit about our Sustainable Communities Initiative. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Jose Bodipo Memba, and Aziza gave a great introduction about SMUD. We are the electric utility for Sacramento County. As you guys can see from the PowerPoint, I'll talk a little bit to it. We're really engaged in the sustainable communities conversation and excited to be a part of one of the partners with the Black Chamber. But I'm guessing some people here are wondering, what does an electric company have to do with sustainability? Why are we engaged in the sustainable communities conversation? And for us, it really comes down to our core values and some issues that we've really seen rise within the Sacramento region. There was a study done by the Brookings Institute in 2018, and it studied the economic prosperity of our region for over the last 10 years. And while there's been an economic boom generally within the United States over that period, the disparity gap has increased between the haves and the have-nots at a faster pace than ever. In fact, in Sacramento County, we've actually had the highest rate of increase over that same period. And so as a part of that study, it really brought to mind for SMUD, what can we do to be a part of that conversation and solving the problem? And so our leadership and some of those folks who are represented here wanted to walk hand in hand with our partners to figure out a way to really impact communities where they need it. And so our Sustainable Communities Department was really grown from that. It's an opportunity for us to take our outreach, but be more targeted in those communities that need it and partner with these folks here at the table and really identify what are those key indicators that are necessary to make a community truly sustainable. Again, we don't want one-time hits, as Chief Hahn said before. We're trying to find ways in which communities can thrive overall. So we're focusing on social well-being. We're focusing on health and environment. And we have experts like Jamal who can talk a lot about the health component. And the economic prosperity discussion. Everything from workforce development to getting businesses in communities that have been left behind for the last 30, 40 years. And then for us, mobility is a really big key indicator as we move into the future with electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, how we make sure that our communities aren't left behind. So we feel by hitting all those targets, we can help our communities thrive. And so SMUD's taking it seriously, but we aren't trying to do it by ourselves. We see that partnerships is the key. You'll hear about that, as Aziza mentioned before. We don't have to always agree on everything, but it's about bringing your best talents to the forefront. So we've identified some near-term partners, and the Black Chamber has been a great partner. And we've worked together on putting together the Promise Zone Collaborative. We have 11 organizations, including UC Davis, Blue Shield, the Black Chamber, SHRA, and a number of others have basically put their money where their mouths are for real projects to happen in our neighborhoods. And with all these partners, we're really looking at measuring those outcomes and being able to share those so it's not just a Sacramento problem that we solve, but a national problem that we're able to solve. So here's just a list of some accomplishments. I'm not going to go through them because you really want to hear from the speakers today, but I really want you to focus on a couple of things on this list. We talk about $17.8 million of investment into our communities. A big component of that is through the RISE program, where we're actually targeting loan funds to start businesses and companies in our neighborhoods, and we're helping guide that through our policy. But as you can see on the far right side, those partnership wins are community wins. So there are partners like the city, there's partners like smaller nonprofits like the Roberts Development Center, which is a great program in Del Paso Heights. We're working with universities. We're working collaboratively to really look at the sustainability effort, because ultimately we got to do it ourselves, as Aziza said before. We aren't waiting for any sort of bill coming from the White House. We have to make sure it happens in our communities right away. So what are we trying to get done? And you'll hear more about it from our speakers today. We at SMUD want to contribute to closing that gap. We want to make sure that disparity is not an issue in Sacramento, and we contribute to the bigger conversation overall. And we want to take that framework and share it, that the strategy is key. We want to be able to measure outcomes. We want to make sure that we aren't just feeling good about the work we do, but it's actually doing real work. And then lastly, we want to be able to leverage our skill sets, leverage our talent. We want to borrow ideas from here, folks here at the conference, to take back home and make our community better, and vice versa. So ultimately, we're glad and proud to be a part of this collaborative. We're really excited to really be focused on targeted outcomes in communities that need it, and not just spreading the wealth for no reason. It's not about dollars and cents. It's about the effort and the focus, and we're really about bringing that work to the forefront. So thanks again for the opportunity, and look forward to a great conversation. So I would like to introduce the moderator for the conversation. He is the president and publisher of the Sacramento Observer, a longtime partner of the Sacramento community and the oldest Black newspaper in the Sacramento region, Mr. Larry Lee.
Thank you, sir. I'm debating on whether I'm going to stand or sit. I think I'm going to sit. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well, too. Again, as Jose mentioned, my name is Larry Lee. I'm president and publisher of the Sacramento Observer newspaper, and former board chair of the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce as well, too. And very proud to be a part of this panel and having been part of the early discussions on trying to see how we can help share what's going on in Sacramento, the challenges and the successes that we've had over the years, and share it with our congressional leadership here at the Congressional Black Caucus Convention. So what I'd like to first do is, if I can get each person, we'll go down from my immediate left to just introduce yourselves real quick. And we'll just do a brief introduction, and then we'll move forward with the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamal Miller. I am the Director for Corporate Reputation and Thought Leadership at Blue Shield of California. I'm also the former Director of California's Office of Health Equity. I served in the Governor and Jerry Brown's administration. Glad to be here. And I'm also on the Board of Directors for the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamelia Land. I am a criminal justice and social justice reform advocate and activist. I am the founder of Mind Change, I am here, thanks to Ms. Aziza, to engage in this conversation about sustainability in our communities, but very specifically around social justice issues.
Yeah, and I am Stevante Clark, Mr. Clark. Community organizer. I work with children as an instructional aide, and I'm a community activist in the greater Sacramento area.
Afternoon, I'm Daniel Hahn.
Police chief in the Sacramento Police Department.
Good afternoon, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, former mayor of Baltimore. Glad to be here to talk about sustainable communities.
Great. All right, so I'll first start this off with Mayor Rawlings Blake, if you can kind of address this. You having been a leader of a major metropolitan city like Baltimore, what's your definition of what is a healthy and a safe community, and what should that look like from the African American perspective, from your perspective?
So healthy and safe community is a community in where every family knows that their children have an opportunity to reach their fullest and highest potential, where they can thrive. The thing, and I talked about this a little at the press conference, the thing for me about sustainable communities is that determination, what that looks like, is not what it looks like to me. It's what it looks like to the people who live there. And I always took that approach as a public servant. I was interested in being in public office since I was very young. And for me, it was about educating myself to the best of my ability so I could bring those talents to Baltimore to help enrich my community and make it better. And it wasn't all of my grand ideas. It was being in communication with the people that I served to make sure that the tax dollars that they were sending us worked in their best interest. And you can't guess at that. So you have to, it frustrated me in public office for so long to have meeting after meeting when people would come in and say, I've got a great idea, I want to put a community center X. I have a great idea, I want to put a program for kids in Y neighborhood. And it seemed like the people with the resources to do a lot of things hadn't had one conversation with the community to see if that was something that they wanted to do. They just had a big idea. And I welcome investment in our communities, but I always encourage people to make it about the people that you serve, not about yourself. So that's, to me, that's when we get a healthy and safe community. And I also talked earlier about when the resources that communities need, as identified by them, are of high quality and reachable. That you can't, to say that we have mental health, but it's in none of the areas, none of the communities where mental health is needed. Right. It doesn't matter if there's the best hospital in the country, on the other side of town, if it's not accessible to the people that are really in need.
Okay, Chief Hahn, can you elaborate from your perspective as well too? What's kind of your definition of a healthy and safe community, particularly from the African American perspective, community's perspective?
Yeah, my definition is very simple. It's hard to get there and very nuanced and takes a lot of different entities and people to get there. But to me, it's pretty simple. Everybody has hope, and everybody has the ability to chase their dreams, or equal ability. Oftentimes, what I see in our community is a very huge lack of hope, and also many people that don't dream of doing any of the things that a lot of us dream to do. So, I mean, there's studies that talk about the PTSD in neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence and kids grew up. That was the kind of neighborhood I grew up in. The difference between a lot of the people that I knew and a lot of my friends in that same neighborhood that saw a lot of the same things is inside my home was a very structured, very capable mom and family to help me deal with that, I assume. And in my friend's house, they didn't have a lot of that. And so, but it's still something they see on their doorstep every day. I taught at Grant High School for a couple years, and you'd ask the kids what they wanted to do when they grew up. And they would say things that you'd like, I knew they wanted to do more than that. And when you ask them, why don't you want to do something else? Why is that what you want to do? Their answer would be, because that's all I can do, because I'm Hmong, or because I'm black, or because that was the reason. And so they didn't just make that up in their head, they've been trained that way by society, by their community. And so to me, a healthy community is one where as people grow up, they have hopes and dreams, and they have the ability to chase those. And then it's up to them. But right now, in a lot of our communities, they don't have hope, and they don't have an equal ability to chase those dreams.
Devontae,
Yeah.
from your perspective,
A healthy community.
Mhm.
What is a healthy community? A healthy community to me is trust with the community and the ones who are sworn to protect and serve us. You know, good partnerships between the community and law enforcement. That's a good start. And I think before we start diving on all these other things such as gang violence, gang culture, economics, we need to make sure that if we're in trouble, we can trust and count on the people who come and are supposed to help us and be there for us, you know. I don't see a lot of that, especially in Sacramento. You know, there's a total divide between law enforcement and community like myself. And we need to find some type of way to find common ground where we can work together. My thing was I was always talking about, you know, protection in the community is a form of de-escalation tactical teams, you know, where we could, you know, police our own communities in ways. But in reality, I don't think we're there as a community. I really don't think we're there. Mm-hmm. So we have to work with the police. We have to work with other groups and entities. So a healthy community for me is a safe community, a community where, you know, you don't get shot over 20 or over 8 times in your grandma's backyard. You know, that's what a healthy community to me is. You know, I'm here as the vessel for my brother's legacy because he's not here, and what's healthy for me is what's healthy for everybody, I believe. Mm-hmm. And if I feel safe in my community, and I feel protected by those who take our dollars, our tax dollars, then I think everybody else would feel safe and protected.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And just for context, for those of you who may not be familiar with our story here, is Stevante's brother, Stefan, was shot in March of 2018 in his backyard by the Sacramento Police Department. And it was not long after Chief Hahn had taken reins as the city's first black chief. So we have kind of a very special...
yeah, but it's no, I want to put out there, not to cut you off, there's no ill will towards Chief.
No, I know.
Yeah, we love Danny.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think that's where I was going, is that we have a very special and unique relationship from our perspective and from the city of Sacramento, where we have a police chief who is, as an individual, is a trusted messenger who has for years had done the work in the city, and then, but has now come into a position where he had this very challenging situation,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, brother, but at the same time, you know, we still calling for accountability
Of course,
on all levels.
absolutely,
Okay, so,
absolutely,
all right.
absolutely. So,
Okay.
but I just wanted to put that in
Missed
context. But there's a reason we sat them next to each other.
Yeah. Fire them damn cops, Chief.
All right, there we go. All right, Jamelia, same to you. What's, from your perspective, what's a healthy community look like for the African American community?
Well, for me, it starts with our mental health. As I've shared with Stevante and Chief and a few others, I am a firm believer that racism in this country is a socially constructed, systematically implemented mental health disease. And it impacts everyone. For me, a healthy community is one where we are able to think beyond our basic everyday survival. To kind of piggyback off of what some of what Shuhan has said, is that we don't have hope. There is a lack of hope in our communities. We live in communities that are economically disenfranchised. We have less resources all the way around, and our children no longer look forward to tomorrow. They are pipelined from schools directly into the prison industrial complex. They are dying at the hands of not only law enforcement, but also other people of color in their communities. And so for me, what a healthy community looks like is for us as African Americans to really come to the table and have an honest conversation about accountability amongst ourselves. Take responsibility for ourselves. While we oftentimes want to challenge others to be transparent and to be accountable, we oftentimes fall short of doing that ourselves. And so for me, it's important. I am here as a part of standing up and speaking about Stevante, very specifically. What I saw happen to him was something that I have seen countless times, but no one would stand up and speak. My son's girlfriend was murdered 5 years ago, New Year's Eve, and he had to drive her to the hospital. She was shot in his car, and he had to remove her body from the car. I watched him quickly decline. I watched my son within a matter of 3 or 4 days completely lose his mind, and people didn't understand. And so when I saw Stevante jumping on the mayor's desk and lashing out in all of these different ways, and I heard the commentary, the social media posts, things that all the negativity that people had to say, I wanted them to understand what they were looking at. They were looking at a child in trauma, and that it was not rare, and that what Stevante was displaying is something that our children, adults, are experiencing every day, but we don't have an outlet. And as I have told him time and time again, I am very proud of him for letting the world see the depth of the trauma and the pain that we are experiencing. And so we've got a lot of work to do.
Jamal, you've spent a lot of time in your work in this sort of space, particularly related to healthy communities. Sherry, from your perspective, what does it look like?
A sustainable community for me is one where the social, economic, geographic, political, and physical, or the built environmental conditions, they lead to creation of a fair and just society. That's a technical but very practical realization that for some communities, when you think about the determinants of equity, sustainable communities that are built to last and that are built equitably to benefit all people in those communities, they're socially strong, they're economically strong, they're geographically strong, they're politically strong and engaged, and their built environment, their resources and their amenities are conducive to healthy living. And when you look at the kind of broader public health framework and you look downstream at mortality rates and morbidity rates, when we think about disease and injury and behavioral practices, when we do take ownership of our lives, the indicators, particularly for the most disadvantaged, for communities of color, the most vulnerable, the indicators show that many of those exogenous factors that I just mentioned aren't necessarily nurturing, but they're doing more damage and presenting what's called community-oriented trauma. When you think about a kid that's born today in the Sacramento County that's white, who may live 95831 on the other side of I-5, on the west side of I-5, versus 95832 Meadowview. That kid from 95831 has a greater life expectancy than that kid right across the freeway in the Meadowview community. And what has that baby done, coming into this world to automatically be set back by anywhere from 5 to 7 years? Based on a public health framework and ecosystem, exogenous factors that are not catered to meet the nurturing needs from a health, mental health, and behavioral health standpoint. So when I think about myself, who I grew up in South Sacramento, born and raised, when I think about people like Stevante, when I think about people like Chief Hahn, we all grew up in the area and all uniquely as black men have stories to share about experiences that we've had to where in our different ways we've demonstrated a sense of resiliency, which I think is a key attribute to sustainability. But also the reality is that we could speak very well to, from the earliest phases in our lives, there was a sense of trauma that we may have experienced in some way, shape, or form. And when that trauma yields itself to a murder or a sickness or a child dropping out of school or any number of the negative issues that are indicators in society, we often tend to blame that person and not shifting upstream and realizing that the ecosystem around them basically presented a logical conclusion because we let them down. When you look at community trauma, they result in structural inequities such as violence, such as failing out of school systems, criminalization of mental illness, as we've talked about, substance dependency, concentrated poverty, poor food systems. These traumatize people, and it yields itself to stressors, elevated allostatic load, elevated cortisol, which puts pressure on your organs. So it makes sense when, the onset of diabetes and heart disease and other, issues in our minds and in our bodies have been disrupted literally for some of us throughout the course of our lives. And then it starts to make sense why we meet death or meet sickness much sooner. So that's the reality of understanding the public health framework. And when we think about the definition of sustainability, that's something that lasts. And in our society, my last comment is, how do you build something that lasts? Dr. King says that although it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart of a man, it can restrain the heartless. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me. And the powerful component of that statement is understanding the value of policy change and regulation to really stipulate and require that we build communities, we provide resources and legislation and amenities and products and goods that help people thrive and have optimal health, mental health, and well-being. And what policy does by requirement is it systematizes and institutionalizes in a favorable way. It builds something in that is not just a good idea, but when you think of something like AB 392 or any number of legislation or bills that have passed, building in more equitable practices is a key to any sustainable community, because then it can last. And that's my take on what a sustainably healthy community is and should be.
Gotcha. It's interesting. The word trauma came up several times, obviously, in your analysis, not just yours, but everyone. And I think it's interesting because the African American experience is based on trauma. It's not like we came to this country of our own will and with people that we knew. We were forced to be together, and so it's our experience has been traumatic. So you mentioned resiliency. That's something that is, we have it in spades in our community, the ability to bounce back. And Mayor Rawlings, if you could, what did you guys do in Baltimore to try and deal with the effects of trauma? We talked about, the systematic trauma that plagues our community today. What did you all do there that was something that worked? And then actually I'd like to kind of ask the rest of the panel as well too, and you guys can just jump in. How do you feel from your position, maybe Chief Hahn, maybe you'd be the first one to kick in, on how you feel the city of Sacramento is doing with addressing sustainability programs or efforts to kind of address and bridge that traumatic gap.
And Larry, one of the things I think would be helpful as we're talking about sustainable communities and trauma, in Baltimore we dealt with trauma from a public health standpoint and worked a lot in our schools to help young people identify what trauma felt like, what it looked like, help teachers to understand, and to bring programs like mindfulness, and in some classes, some schools, they did yoga classes and things like that, things that would help young people listen to their bodies in a way that they could identify that, this is what they're going through, so then you can get help. Which I think is definitely important, and it's, those are the types of things that I think cities are doing, many cities are doing to try to deal with childhood trauma. But more broadly, when I think about what's happening in our cities across the country and in Sacramento, the issue of trauma as it relates to public safety is a whole problem. And I say that we talked about it a little bit, like as it relates to police-community relations, but it is a true relationship, meaning when people are living in trauma, everyone experiences trauma. And I was always interested in trying to help the police own that part of it, because I think far too often first responders think that they cannot own being in traumatic situations. This is what I signed up to do. It is part of the job. But being in traumatic situations day after day has an impact on the people who live there, the people that work there. In communities, and the people, and when I say work there, including our first responders. And I'm interested in ways that we can, and suggestions, I think, for how we can bridge that gap. So in these traumatic relationships, we can break through and try to get to trust.
We're getting the trust.
So let me just say, just as an example of what happens in a lot of our communities. So I was blessed that at 3 months old, I was adopted by my mom and dad. If I hadn't been adopted, I can guarantee my road would have been a lot tougher. Unfortunately, my dad died when I was 5, so I was basically raised by my mom. I witnessed the murder in front of our house. My brother and I were the only witnesses to a guy that got shot 10, 15 times in front of our house on a Sunday afternoon. When I was about 9 years old, had to testify in court a couple years later. I was arrested for assault on an officer when I was 16. My younger brother, when I was a fairly new police officer, was murdered because he got involved into drugs, and one of his partners that dealt drugs murdered him. It was in my beat, on my shift, and I identified him while I was working. So, but I also had a support structure that helped me through all of that. And unfortunately, it was just my mom. It should have been my mom and dad, but he died. So, but she worked it out. So I say all that to say that some of the things that we do, and Martin Luther King mentioned this also, you can write anything you want on paper. You can make all the laws, you can make all the rules, but that's one thing, and then making sure it takes place in reality is a whole nother thing. And so it's not that we don't need new laws. Society changes, we evolve, we learn from our mistakes, hopefully, and so laws are important. But we have a people problem. That's what we have, and people solve people problems. So things specifically to law enforcement, body cameras, things like that. It's not that they're important, they are very important. I think any police department without body cameras right now is way behind the curve. But we sell it as that's the solution, and it's not. People are the solution. So a lot of the things, and there are handouts in the back of things we're doing in Sacramento, and they're all meant to do this, is get people together, better understanding, building relationships, because then you can find better solutions. But also, I've had the privilege and probably not so much privilege of patrolling a neighborhood as a police officer that my mom lived in. I did not like doing it because I knew everybody there, and like there goes Mario, and there. But I can tell you, when I was at work, my mom's street was the safest street in the whole city, no doubt. And so the street I grew up on, back when I was growing up, there was a couple locations where women were trafficked. My street was one of those locations. And so I saw prostitution, drugs every day It was very normal. I didn't think about it at all. And so you have to think of what is that doing to people subconsciously. So what we do and what we work on a lot with a lot of organizations in the city is we try to bring police officers and community members together for meaningful interaction, meaning not on a call. So we, like, for example, just as one example, we have a Walk in My Shoes program. So our officers, after they graduate from the academy, when they're still fairly new, they go spend the day with a community member. Might be a barber. I'm thinking of one in particular. He went to a barber out in South Sacramento at Mack and Valley High. Stevante probably knows him, Rob Brown. Spent the day with them. It's the first time he'd ever been in a black barbershop. And so then the barber the next month does a ride-along with the police officer, because it's important that both people understand what people's challenges are, who they are, because that's a real relationship. And I could go on and on about that ride-along because he did some amazing things on that ride-along, the barber. But to me, that's the important part. We have to get people to better understand people. So, you know, as you all know, when people become police officers, they go through an academy. Our academy is 6 months long. It's very intense. And we give them equipment. We give them all sorts of training. And the training is way different than when I went through. There's a lot more important things added to that training, implicit bias and things like that. But one of the things I think for sure, like I understand some of the communities that we're talking about because I grew up in one. But if I did not grow up in one, it's like when people came to my neighborhood was Oak Park. If I had a friend come to Oak Park and say, let's go play basketball in Del Paso Heights, I'd have said, you're crazy. I'm not going there. I'm staying in my own neighborhood. I don't go to other neighborhoods. And so if you live in one of the wealthy, non-diverse neighborhoods, are you hanging out in Del Paso Heights or Oak Park or South Sac? No. So you go through the academy and then you get all this equipment. In my opinion, the most powerful job in our entire country is a police officer, because you can take somebody's freedom away or take their life. And then we put them first thing, because those are our most worked neighborhoods. So most of our officers work in these neighborhoods on swing shift or graveyard. And we put them in those neighborhoods. And then when something goes wrong, we blame that person. I think we should blame ourselves. We should blame our organization, we should blame society, and we should blame our community in the sense that we didn't anticipate that that could be a problem. So a lot of what is on those sheets that you can pick up at the back is how do we, not only do they go through the academy to equip themselves how to use handcuffs, the baton, the gun, how to talk to people, de-escalation, all that, but we also need to equip our people to work in, to have experiences that they don't have, to work in neighborhoods that they don't have any experience with at all before they have to work in those neighborhoods. And so that's what we try to do, and there's a list of a lot of those things that we do. But in general, that's what those are meant to do, is break down, you know, a lot of biases, relationships, and get understanding before we have to actually work. Because no matter what we do, there's still going to be times where officers have to arrest people. There's still going to be times where it's contentious. So how do we do that in the best possible way we can?
Gotcha. Jamal, can you expand, like, from the you know, from your position in regards to how we can use these vehicles to help sustain or help build sustainable efforts that'll break these down?
Yeah, I think that we have to have, and Chief Hahn and I spoke about it a couple of weeks ago, we have to have a fundamental shift towards an attitude of prevention. So I'll give you an example. In healthcare, our healthcare delivery system is focused on disease management, like in volume. So we wait until you're sick, and you know, we're finding now from a value proposition perspective, we have to focus and shift upstream on how do we keep people healthy. And when we think about a whole person care approach, as was mentioned earlier by Stephanie, we have to understand that health care, mental health, access, and even policing, those are just three components aside with other facets that we interface with. We live, learn, work, play, and pray in a society that is either going to yield us to a disease state in our mind and or in our body, and it's very, very costly. So from a sustainability standpoint, we've got to shift our mind in healthcare and social services and public safety and many other facets of life into how do we prevent the worst case scenarios that compromise a person's life expectancy, compromise quality of life, and are very costly from a private and public cost perspective, and that's where we see the greatest opportunities to where obviously people are going to get sick sometimes, and as Chief mentioned, sometimes people will have to be apprehended, detained, and or arrested, but what could have been done upstream in that person's life course, in their community, in their ecosystem, to maintain them with an economic floor, you know, to maintain them with access to health care and coverage, to maintain them, you know, with a job, to allow them as a child to be able to go to school and not be called the dumb fool like my third grade teacher called me. And every time I get a chance, I remind folks that I went to an Ivy League school, so he was not right. But it was a traumatic experience. So the point that I'm making is we've got to fundamentally shift and get outside of this boxed-in thinking of downstream solutions and shift to like real sustainable solutions that are about prevention, investing in people, investing in programs, early childhood development, ensuring that mothers who are expecting children have a safe and a sound environment to where they're not stressed out due to racism. They're not stressed out due to poverty, because studies show that when the mom is stressed out, genetically, that's being transferred into the baby, and the baby's being born with elevated cortisol and stress levels. So if you start life like that, and you sustain that throughout the course of your life, it becomes very expensive, and it yields itself to downstream results that we all would like to avoid. So I think we learned something from the public health framework by focusing on prevention, whole person kind of primary care, and ensuring people have access, equitable access to the resources, amenities that they need to be safe, to be nurtured, to be supported, to be empowered, and to be enfranchised. For many of our communities that have experienced a lot of the ills that I just mentioned, don't vote, aren't politically engaged, their voices aren't being heard at the city, county, state, or federal level, so people end up getting elected to office. This didn't happen with the past mayor of Baltimore, but people end up getting elected to office who literally don't represent or reflect the lived experiences of those districts. So many costs associated with the downstream mentality. So prevention, upstream, leads to sustainable results that will benefit all of society and not just some.
That's right. Now, Jamelia and Savante, I want to come to you because, you know, 2 years ago, this was not a space that you were occupying much.
I was a rapper.
Right. He was a rapper.
Yeah, that talks some shit.
And so now, obviously, you know, you and your family have been, you know, put into this space, and so admirably, you as a family, you all as a family have stepped up and have really made, we think, a voice to many who were without voices. And from your perspective, and you hear kind of these structural things, I deliberately kind of went to the others who were more involved with kind of structural things. On the ground level, what sort of things are you seeing that are working? I want to stay in the positive. What sort of things are you seeing that are working within the community that you say, you know, 5 years ago we didn't have this, but we have this now, or 2 years ago we didn't have this and we have that now. And Jamelia, you think the same way as well too. What sort of things are you seeing in our communities, in your communities and specifically that are you're seeing some successes that you say, okay, it may not impact this kid today, but that kid, you know, 5 years from now might have a chance?
There was a program I took, a class, and it's crazy because I'm looking at my phone. Tammy Jones, the lady who invited me to the last one. It was called a TPM class. By
TPM?
Yeah, Jamelia, what's it stand for?
Transformational Policing Model.
Gotcha.
And what it did was, you know, they put some community members in the room, and they put law enforcement in the room, and we took a post class pretty much. And it was a lot. It was implicit bias we were talking about. We did case studies. We separated in groups and had, you know, group time with law enforcement and community members. It was just very informative, and it was. I actually thought it was so informative. I want to do it again in my community. you know. But things like that, getting along for, and I said,
So let me just ask you, so the makeup of in that TPM meeting, was it
mostly cops.
mostly cops?
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I was shocked.
You were mostly a fly on the wall, or
No, they all
they?
fucking stared at me like I was Devontae.
Okay.
You know, but it was so. I've never been in a room with so many fucking cops in my life. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. No, I haven't. I was like, you know, sorry, Aziza. I was like, you know, I can't believe this. You know, I mean, where's the community at?
Right.
We talking about bridging. Y'all need to be here, letting them have it. You know, the only person that was there crying and all emotional was Jamila.
Oh.
You know, she was in there. You know, highly emotional. You know what I mean?
He calls me the crybaby.
Yeah, I'm like, you're a crybaby, like, you know. But it's all right, you know. But we talked about a lot, you know. And I think things like that, putting us in the same room in our communities, hearing how police officers, because there was a black cop in there, and your cop from San Diego, I think the guy.
Dr. Tommy Tunson. He was
No.
the instructor.
Chief Boy, the one that worked for the department. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
He's like, I got stopped by 11 times, and you know, I must have been doing something wrong each time. I'm like, nah, maybe not. You know, maybe people messing with you. You know, if you get stopped 11 times like that, you know, so consecutive, maybe you shouldn't be driving. You know, get them off patrol. You know, but it was meaningful conversations, meaningful dialogue, and I just wish more community had come out, you know, but we're following up with that. We're doing a Walking While Black,
Movie.
Friday. The department we're following that same group that was there.
Mm-hmm.
Will be coming and sitting down watching a film or a presentation of some sorts with PD. And my thing is I want to add more, because Tammy, the one who helped orchestrate that, just said she has a few spots left.
Great.
So I want to get more community involved in that, because I think that conversation helps when it comes to bridging the gap.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Mayor, I'm gonna go to the mayor real quick, and I'll come right back to you.
Well, my question is for Slavante and Jamila as well. When you talked about you two being the only ones from the community at the meeting, that happens so much, and it's not just in Sacramento. You know, it pained me when I would go to community, you know, when I was invited, not the things that I hosted, you know, but invited to community meetings, and there would be so few people there. And yet when something major happens, everyone comes out.
Right.
And I would always talk about the fact that it's important. I don't, you know, I got in trouble for protecting people's free speech, you know, and making sure that people had space to protest. I got in trouble, you know, I got a lot of heat for that. I respect the First Amendment. I respect people's right to protest. It's important. But I would always talk about the fact that the work happens between the protests, and how do we galvanize people. So I'd be very interested in hearing from both of you, you know, how do we get people involved in between these events, so we can hopefully help prevent these flashpoints from happening, because we've been in relationship, because we've been doing the work to create the communities that we want to see on a consistent basis, not just when something bad happens.
I think that, number one, that's a great question. I think that it goes back to something that Chief Hahn said, and that this is a people problem. And we as people tend to not want to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. A little backdrop on my relationship with Devontae. I'm born and raised in Oakland, California, moved to Sacramento about 20 years ago. Just me and my senior parents and children. And I have one biological son. It was watching him and raising him and realizing that I had a young black man on my hands, and that law enforcement may be an issue, but other young black men of color may be an issue, that his life was constantly threatened. And the trauma that I experienced as a parent feeling that, and having to teach and instruct my son to conduct himself in certain manners that I know others do not have to instruct their children. And so I became very involved with my son, making sure that I was on top of the school and on top of the friends and what was going on, because I needed him to live long enough to be able to do something with his life. And so I've always just really been there for the young men in my community. So I'm everybody's auntie. We don't have any biological relationship, but when his brother was killed in his grandmother's backyard, that was the flashpoint for me. That is when I decided that I couldn't sit silently anymore and watch these things happen. And so when Stevante was going through it, and I was watching the things that people had to say, I realized that someone had to say something. It was not planned. I was there with Mama Sequita. She was in so much pain she couldn't speak. And so I stood up and I spoke from my heart what I saw. I saw organizations coming together and people starting not-for-profits and putting up GoFundMes and making this money and all these news stories. But what they didn't see was the grandmother at home who was taking care of her double amputee husband who goes to dialysis 3 days out of the week. They didn't see the young man who has lost one brother to community gang violence and another at the hands of law enforcement. And so I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was just going to keep having these conversations amongst a few groups of people and really getting nowhere with them, or if we were going to really stand up and put ourselves in a different position. And so it was through Chief Hine, because I won't lie, I was very, very nervous of law enforcement. They get behind me and I get nervous, my back tense up, I'm grabbing the steering wheel, I'm checking. I know I've got license, registration, all of this stuff, but I have this fear. And it was encountering him, and I think that it's important to make note that one of the first things I wanted to ask him was this: what is it like being a black man in that blue uniform? Because you're going to catch hell either way it goes. In our community, you've got one of two things. We are either extremely proud of you for being a black man and being the first black police chief, or you are every sellout, coon, no good, traitor under the sun. On that side of the blue wall, he's still a nigga. Period. They don't see anything else. And so to watch him engage and want to engage with Stevante and want to engage with the community, he put together with Dr. Tommy Tunson the transformational policing model class that Stevante has been talking about. It was through the personal interaction. Now when I see him, whether he's in uniform or not, I see Daniel. I don't see a police officer. I'm cognitive and aware, so I don't speed past him. You know, and I'm not looking for any favors. Don't give me a ticket if I speed past you. But I'm cognitive and aware. And when he puts together things, so I've gone on, he does the Friday Oak Park Walk, where he takes members from the community and members from law enforcement, and we walk through the community. And we got dogs barking, pit bulls, broke down cars, people on the corner smoking weed, and you've got predominantly white officers walking through this black community. So when they get ready to patrol this community, they have an understanding of the people that are there. It is things like that that we oftentimes don't see, that we definitely do not talk about, that the news media doesn't really want to report on, because who wants to talk about the positive things that we're doing? We live in such a negatively charged society that when you start talking anything positive, when you start talking about building bridges and building the gaps, no one wants to talk about that. The fact that we have the chief of police of a police department where two of his officers took this young man's brother's life, and they are sitting here and they are willing to engage in dialogue, That's where we start. That's where we begin to affect change. And those questions that I had for him, what was it like being black with a blue uniform? I quickly found out, not that I am in a blue uniform, but now, depending on the space that I am in, you're a sellout. You smell like bacon. You over there playing with the pigs. How is it one day you're standing up and you're talking about the police murdering us, and then you're at the academy? I'll tell you why. Because we have a black chief of police. If he was white, it would not happen. He opened the door to say, these are the things that I am trying to do, not short term, long term, that will positively impact our communities, because this is my home. And so for me, that was a big step in being able to trust, in building trust. And it takes one person at a time to be able to build that trust. And so the fact that he has mandatory things that people don't know about. His officers have to read post-traumatic slave syndrome. Where else do we see that? Are we hearing these things? And so it's important for us, especially in the black community, as we talk about law enforcement and violence, going back to that accountability of self, we also have to talk about the trauma that black on black crime and gun violence in our community is creating as well. And so for me, again, you know, it's about relationships, and it's about building that bridge, and you purposely, consciously, intentionally putting yourself in a position to be the change that you want to see.
Amen. That was good.
I want to be mindful of time. It's about 5:15, but I did want to kind of close it out. But and you all can expand on this. But we'd be remiss. This is the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce that's presenting this, and I want to get from each of you perspective, because we talked a lot about personal relationships and trauma and community organizing and a lot of different things like that. But what role does economics and economic development within the African American community play in addressing all of these issues? Because I think that's an underlining thing that is not being spoken. And how do we get private, public collaboration to address these challenges within our community?
I'll take that real quick. I would say that most of the people would ask you, why are you asking, like, for example, me, that question, right? I'm a police department. We don't have anything to do with economic development. We don't have anything to do with economic development in certain neighborhoods. And I would just say that's a perfect question to ask me and everybody else. Our mission statement says, improve the quality of life in our city in partnership with our community. It doesn't talk about arresting people. It doesn't talk about writing tickets. It says that. Now, arresting people and tickets are one of the many ways that we can help with that, but it's much broader. And so I just got a call from a friend of mine that was asking, there's a local business owner that wants to expand their business into another field, and asked me if I could connect them with Sac State to help them write a business plan and things like that. So I was going to do that as the police chief, just simply because I know Sac State. And then just, matter of fact, today, talking to Aziza, she said, why aren't you sending them to the Black Chamber to do that? So now I'm going to do that. So, but that's because we know each other. Not too long ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, Nicole's in the audience, Jose's up here. I know both of them. I also know the CEO of SMUD, and there's a local organization, City of Refuge, that helps women escape sex trafficking. They're doing a capital campaign. They're going to build a building where women can live, and then they're going to have a restaurant and a daycare center so they can take their children there and start getting work skills and transition into much healthier things. So they were calling me, and they're saying, you know, we're raising money, we're going to do this, and they're an awesome organization, but they don't have a ton of money. So I thought, well, maybe SMUD can help because for energy savings on their building. So they went it took us a while to get all these very important people to have time to go at the same time, but we took them on a tour of their current facilities. And just the day I flew here to DC, Rochelle from the City of Refuge called me darn near crying, saying how thankful she was that SMUD is helping them. And I don't even know all that they're doing, but they're doing enough to help them, you know, raise money and get done, because they're helping. I think earlier Jamal or somebody said preventative. They're the kind of, they're after the fact sometimes, but they're also preventing further harm by getting women into a healthier environment. So I think that leaders have to lead and truly lead. Too many times we have leaders in leadership positions that I don't want to say completely selfish, but appear to be selfish, like I need to get something done in the next year, in the next 10 minutes, as opposed to the end game's going to take longer than my tenure. So I need to drive the bus down as far as I can. And so being somebody that's lived every single day of my life in Sacramento, and being somebody that started in the Sacramento Police Department when I was 19 by accident, I completely believe where Sacramento can be, which is a completely healthy for everybody. We're not going to get there in my career. We're not. But I am going to drive as fast as I can and as far as I can, and hopefully hand it off to somebody else that believes, and maybe 5 chiefs down the road, 5 mayors down the road, 5 chamber CEOs down the road, 5 activists down the road. We will get there. But we can't get there in my tenure. And if all I care about is getting there in my tenure, then we're going to have superficial things that are done.
I would say that just by listening to you and the other activists, I hope you understand how special Sacramento is when it comes to approaching public safety and community development. You talk about economic development. You can't have economic development where there are unsafe communities. That is what speeds disinvestment and flight when businesses don't feel that they can be safe. So to have a chief and to have a group that so keenly understands the relationship between public safety and trauma, public safety and mental health, public safety and economic development, public safety in all of the things that matter to communities in a way that, in talking about holding each other accountable, truly, and not just pointing fingers. That's a special thing. You know, you might not get there in your lifetime, but the principles that you're putting and the values, Chief, that you are instilling in those officers won't get lost because, you know, they're ingrained. And I'm very optimistic because of the way that you're approaching these things that, you know, having a safe community is possible. And having safe communities in Sacramento is definitely possible.
And I know some real estate agents, so I'm going to make sure they send you some real estate listings. You too can come to Sacramento.
Join the team. I'm retired.
I would
He's
add.
smart.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I would add that to the chamber question, studies have shown that socio-political participation is a function of socioeconomic status. So from an individual perspective and from a corporate standpoint, when you think about economic policy, private investments, that naturally increases the pool of like available participants to vote, to be engaged in the political process that helps create and keep communities safe and healthy. So that's a part to where you think about the social determinants of health. Income security in economics is a significant determinant of life expectancy, quality of life, safety of communities, and it increases naturally people's ability to participate in the socio-political process. So from a chamber perspective, that is something that I think particularly when, you know, talking to corporate sponsors or, you know, talking to city council members or state legislatures, that's value added from chambers like the Sacramento Black Chamber to say that we are strengthening the base of communities through individual and corporate economic policies
Let me just check, just in a non-Ivy League way, you just said the more money you have, the more politically active you are.
Basically.
Okay, I just wanted to
and the extension.
I just wanted to make sure.
And the extension.
Daniel and I went to state schools.
So check this out. The extension.
There we go. That's Jamal I've been waiting on. Come on.
So check this out. So the extension of that is literally poor people start to disappear earlier in life. So who's more active in the political process? More socioeconomically secure or wealthier people who are more stable and over the course of their lives become more involved in policy making because they're economically strong and more viable. So when poor communities, lessen their participation in the political process, who's curating, designing, and influencing broader public policy? It's people who are economically strong. And that's not a bad thing per se if we're a part of that economically strong group, but if we know that that class of people doesn't necessarily look like us, doesn't come from communities like ours, then odds are the policies and the structures and the institutions that they're influencing are not favorably influencing us. So that's another very strong position I think the Chamber can take on individual and broader economic policy.
Gotcha.
So my last chime in here. Something that I saw was really unique that came out of this tragic situation with Stefan was the civic engagement. In the state of California, youth can pre-register to vote at the age of 16. But what we saw was that we had a lot of youth that were coming out, that were uprising, that were saying, we are tired of seeing these types of killings and this type of brutality engaged in our communities, and we want to do something about it. I think that the political timing and climate just so happened to be right, and that we had the legislation, AB 392, California Act to Save Lives, which is also affectionately being called the Stephon Clark Law, that came out of countless lives that had been taken. And our youth stood up and they said no more. They were marching up and down the streets, but they weren't just outcrying. There was an agenda behind it. And that agenda was, at the time, we had nothing else but AB 392. Though there's varying opinions about the strength or not of this legislative piece, the fact is we were successful in getting it passed. Out of Stefan's murder came a lot of policy change. Sacramento Police Department implemented numerous new policies. Chief Hahn was kind enough to engage me in conversation, and I introduced him to a good friend of mine, Samuel Sinyangwe. He developed the Mapping Police Violence Project. He is one of the country's leading experts on deadly use of force. And they started looking at rewriting SAC-PD's deadly use of force policies before we even started looking at getting this bill passed. And so, it's these types of things. It's building these types of systems that help change what we're doing. And so to be able to take what happened to Stefan and look at the community as a whole. Now we're looking at the city of the specific area of Sacramento called Meadowview. And we see the economic disenfranchisement. How important is it for us to build our communities economically? I think it starts with engaging our youth and for them to understand how much money is actually in poverty, and so that they can start to see the things in our communities as not necessarily it's run down, it's dilapidated, because there are people who are coming into our communities who are making money. We accept EBT at the clothing store. However, the people who are owning these stores don't look like us. They close their doors and they go home at night. And so we have to start empowering ourselves and our children, teach them entrepreneurialism at an early age. Teach them, hey, now I know that in our communities you see drugs. You know ounces, you know grams, you know kilos, but you know it in a negative sense. We have to turn that around and let our children see that, guess what? That's actually science. Do you know that you're a chemist? Do you know that while we are talking about cannabis inequity or equity, that our children need to understand. You're a cultivator. That's agriculture. That we can have community spaces, community gardens, where we are teaching our children the entire process, CBD extraction, all of these other things, because they know it. They know it. They just don't know they know it. And we're not engaging them in positive conversations about it. So in order for us to change the trajectory of our communities economically, we must first educationally invest in our children.
Good job.
Yeah. And we're, before you go, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to let Stevante.
Y'all be real quick.
It's all right, take your time.
No. You guys talked enough. So what I'm going to say is putting people like I'm on a board for Measure U in Sacramento. And basically the city raised our tax, our sales tax 0.5%. And I sit on a commission where we decide where tens of millions of dollars go. Somebody like me is on that board, that commission. I was chosen by a council member to hold that seat. Putting people like me in positions of power like that, even though all our decisions are non-binding, our recommendations are non-binding, you know, it's still a power move. You know, putting people like me in those fields, you know, in those arenas, I think that's an effective way of healing the community, especially economically, because, you know, I wasn't open to all of this, you know, a couple of years ago. Now that my eyes are open, I see how much work needs to be done. Yeah. And it's a lot of hard work that has to be put into it. Yes. You know? And the marching and everything is good, the civil unrest and all that's good, you know, but after you see what happened in LA with the riots, and then you seen, I think, Ferguson, they cut out the Walgreens. After the cameras in the way and everything cut off, they didn't have nowhere to go shop. You know, so we have to look at our communities as our communities. Yeah. And I think once we get put in positions like how I'm in the Measure U Commission and start looking at young brothers and saying, let's get you in here, let's put you on this committee, let's put you on this police commission board, let's put you on this inclusive innovation board, you know what I mean? I think that's a good way to heal us economically in our community.
That's good. Well said. Well said. There's a microphone over here. If anyone wants to throw in any questions.
Don't all come at once.
If you don't mind, say your name and where you're from.
Is it on? Hello? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Adarian Williams. I am a recent graduate from Grambling State University in Louisiana. Yeah. And I am interning in the office of Congressman Richmond. I came in, you guys were in discussion and everything, but I came in on a point about the subject of mental health. And I wanted to see if you all can, first of all, I just want to say that in a time of tragic ordeal, the way that you have taken this entire movement and impacted so many lives is just phenomenal. And I appreciate you. I thank you so much, because I honestly feel that this room should be filled, because this topic, this discussion are things that we continue to talk about in the Black community, and we only, in my opinion, we only talk about it when it happens. Right. But what happens after the fact? Right. You know, and you know, we've been having so many different discussions throughout this entire conference about so many different topics, but after the conference, what's going to take place? You know, so I want to ask you all, how can we begin to shift the mindset of Black people to let them know that your mental health matters, and let them know that it's okay to see a counselor, it's okay to see someone about your mental stability. And also, I want to know how, because I'm 23 years old, how can, I guess, the younger generation, the millennials, put forth more of an effort to talk about these, you know, issues on a broader span, like some of the things that you have been able to do.
Yeah, I would say one thing for us as a community, as a, you know, Black people, we got to stop being so hard, so tough. And we ain't all got to be gangsters. You know, it's all right to be normal and cool and collective and have a good time and smile and say, hey, brother, hey, king, hey, God, how you doing? Not the first question I get, or I used to get before I was, my brother's situation, is where you from?
Where you from?
Yeah, it's the number one question. Geographical locale means more than anything. Yeah, we own no parts of this, but we're dying and fighting, over this. So, us as a black people, we gotta unite more. You see, when I was mad and angry, a lot of people were behind me. Once I started saying stuff like, we gotta bridge the gap between community and law enforcement. What the fuck is he talking about? He crazy now, for real.
Oh, snap.
Yeah, this nigga really crazy. Then you hear a few people like, nah, he's up to something, I tell you. You know what I mean? But it's like, nah, I want to see us all live old and eat good and own land and get fat and move to Miami,
I think one of the key things is, and Mayor Rawlings spoke on it during the press conference, is that in the African American community, mental health is like cussing your mama out. You don't even use those words because we have been so conditioned to believe when grandma had Alzheimer's, we didn't know it was Alzheimer's, she was senile. Mama got sugar, that's diabetes. She just a little crazy, that's schizophrenia. Oh, she's just up and down on the roller coaster. No, that's depression. All of those things are mental health issues. And we don't talk about it. What do? Take it to the Lord in prayer. Now, I'm not against taking it to the Lord in prayer. Amen. But the Bible also says that faith without works is dead.
Who say that?
So the last time I checked, that meant you're going to actually have to do something about your situation. And a part of that, again, goes back to education because we have been systematically conditioned. We stay strong. We cry in silence. We don't let anybody see our pain. You take it to your pastor. That's it. You don't actually go and say, I'm dealing with severe depression, and I have suicidal and homicidal thoughts, and I'm going through this, that, the other, and I need help. Because when we engage each other that way, we say, no, you don't say that. Oh, if people heard you say that, oh, they're going to write that on paper. It's going to be a problem, blah, blah, blah. And so the stigma of mental health in the African American community that we perpetuate amongst ourselves is one of the key problems. We have to get to a place to be able to say, I'm not okay and I need help, and be able to have professionals who look like us, who are trauma informed and trained, who know what we experience to be able to engage us, to help us to heal. But it comes back to we have to be able to be honest and say, I'm off my rocker today. I'm going to jump on the mayor's desk.
I would say it impacts all communities, but it is more profound in many ways in the black community and a few other communities. And part of it is exactly what Jamila just said. I think if we do 2 or 3 things, we could make a huge impact on that. One is, Jamila just mentioned it, is stigma. If we treated mental health the way we do a physical injury, for example, you broke your leg, everybody in this room, regardless of what community you're from, what economic status you are, what race you are, what your background is, if your kid breaks their legs, you're taking them to the ER room. Regardless of whether you think you're going to get in trouble or not by doing that, you're going to take them to, there's no stigma to that, you're just going to go, they're going to come out with a cast. But let that same kid have what you believe is a mental health problem, and you're probably not going to do a darn thing. You're probably, oh, well, that's my baby, that's, you'll make every excuse in the book because of the stigma. And there is some reality to it. Let's just take law enforcement right now. If you're a police officer and you break your leg, what are you going to do? You're going to go to the hospital and get a cast on it. You're going to be off work for a couple weeks, and then you're going to be at desk duty for a couple weeks, and eventually your leg's going to heal, and you're going to be back at work. You're never once going to concern yourself whether the police department is going to allow you to come back to work. But that same police officer say, I'm having some mental health problems. They're now worried, am I going to be able to come back to work when I get these addressed? That's reality. That's a fact. And so I think, one, if we deal with the stigma. Two, if you go back before my lifetime, at some point there was not 911. And so now anywhere in this entire country, if you asked a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old what 911 is, they're going to know. Their parents have taught them how to do it. Society has taught them. And you know what you're going to get. You're going to get a firefighter, a police officer, an ambulance, and you're going to get that within a couple minutes. If we got rid of the stigma and we had that same sort of thing for mental health, that you're going to get some professional mental health person immediately when you call 611 or whatever number it is. I mean, you think of, in a short span of time, probably less than 100 years, this whole country knows what 911 is. So we could do the same thing with that. And so if we got rid of stigma as a society and had an immediate way people knew how to get services and they actually got those services, so many things would be better. A tremendous amount of officer-involved shootings has to do with mental health, that if we had gotten those things dealt with in some form or fashion before, then that shooting wouldn't have happened. And so many things in our community happen that we don't even consider mental health. That young 15-year-old kid driving down the street shooting at another 15-year-old kid because they looked at him wrong, or they're in South Sac instead of Oak Park. There's probably mental health in there too, and they're valuing certain things that a normal, everyday, non-mentally ill person wouldn't put that kind of value on that. They are. And so there's a lot of work to do, and I think if money followed that sort of work, it would start getting done. But those are two big things that would do a lot for mental health.
Yeah.
And Chief, I would say money and effort.
Yes.
And being honest about the needs in the community. You talked about the shooting being related to mental health. Violence has a huge mental health component. So does homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And when I I worked as a public defender when I was started on the council. I'm an attorney, and so many of my clients, I worked in the mental health court. So many of my clients, even before I was worked in the mental health court, I knew that mental illness was contributing to their problems. However, what do you see when you talk about the homeless population? I don't know what day it happens in Sacramento, but every Saturday morning, every Sunday morning, people from all the suburbs and everywhere else, well-meaning.
Mm-hmm. That's every day in Sacramento.
They packed it, you know what I'm saying.
Yes.
They pack their kids up for their community service, and they come and they pass out socks and food. Now, do they need socks and food? Yes. But if you were to really think about what they need so they're not out there next Saturday, a lot of them need treatment. A lot of them need mental health. And that's the hard work. So Jamila was talking about the people not wanting to do the tough stuff. That's the hard work. So it's great. Everybody, you feed them, you feed people, you give them the socks, everybody pats on the back, you go home, and their problems aren't solved. So I think we have to it is the money and the effort of people to be real about what the nature of the core roots of the problem, and be willing to do more than show up for an hour and think that we're going to change somebody's life.
I know we're wrapping up. Just a quick shout out before they sneak out. I saw Oakland come into the room, two of our city council members in Oakland, and a special shout out to our city council member who, actually the topic we're talking about today, about public safety and violence and trauma, unfortunately lost both of her sons, and one most recently, not too far from my alma mater, USC, to gun violence. But just wanted to give you guys a shout out. We see you back there. And I just wanted to make a quick comment on how we separate out like our brain, which is a physiological thing. We bifurcate out mental health as if it's some mystery thing. It's like when we deal with our mind as we do our bodies, self-care becomes so important. And it's like we get the necessary attention, to make sure that we don't wait until, if we have the fortune of not waiting until something extreme happens, we have an opportunity to just maintain good health and incorporate our mind in just as we do our body. Like biochemical imbalance is real. Things happen that impact our emotions. and it's very much so physiological. So there's a science behind it. So once we destigmatize it and educate specifically our people about what's really going on when we are having mental, emotional, behavioral health related issues, it's very much so physical and physiological. And I think one of the first steps that we can do to address the broader society is individually make sure that we're caring for ourselves and factoring in, mind as well as our body and spirit.
Last comment. Again, something unique that has come out of these conversations. When we talk about stigma, mental health, law enforcement, statistics show that in the state of California, 50% of officer-involved shootings involve a person with a mental health issue. We also know that 911 is the first response. We also know that there's not enough training, significant training for law enforcement in this country to deal with people with mental health issues. But there is also something that we have to look at, and something that Chief Hahn touched on, is that a lot of times we do have officers who have been involved in very traumatic situations. And we never really consider their mental health and the fact that they too need mental health help. And they too are afraid of the stigma. And so when we look at all of these things and we talk about mental health as a whole and how can we address these issues within our community, it's important that we look at all of these various aspects. Because at the end of the day, if we are not healthy in our minds, we cannot be healthy in our communities, we cannot build anything, we cannot build strong futures and strong children. Right. And so it is imperative that we stop and we take responsibility and accountability, but we also stand up and speak for those who can't speak for themselves. And when I saw Stevante hurting, and I saw the world ready to demonize him, I felt it was my duty and responsibility to say, you don't know what you're looking at. So let me help you understand. And then I'm going to take it a step further and I'm going to ask you, where are the mental health professionals in the African American community? And why are we not going into that field more? Why do we not have trauma-informed therapists for our children who are dealing with gun violence every day? There's a reason that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old kid is angry and is running down the street or maybe doing whatever he's doing. But when we don't take the time to see each other as human beings, when we other each other, we run into these problems.
Mm-hmm. Please announce your name and where you're from.
I'm Joshua Doss. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I'm from the west side of Chicago. I'm also a recent graduate. Congratulations. Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question. So growing up, I feel like I saw my side of the city do things that humans have done throughout time. Just supply and demand, self-medicate, things like, protect, fight over territory, things that humans have always done, right? But we obviously get criminalized and punished for it in different ways. And I feel like there's a callous that's been built up over the black community, especially my community in Chicago. And I don't know how, as I go on trying to work in politics and create positive solutions to the things I've seen when I grow up, I don't know how to push forward a message that this callous should be pulled off when we have situations like your brother, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, all these things happening. I want to push a narrative that it's time for that callous to come off, but I don't know how I can do it in today's climate, if that makes any sense.
Let me take a shot at that. I mentioned earlier that leaders have to lead, and oftentimes leadership comes with a lot of extreme adversity, meaning some panel members had mentioned this earlier. People that create change is hard for everybody, and when people create change, they're going to get attacked by the very people they're trying to change it for. They're going to get attacked on all sides. And so we just did a round of promotions in my department, and one of the things I told the people that I intended on promoting was, like, if you're doing your job, you're going to piss a whole lot of people off, and you got to do it anyway. You got to do the right thing, regardless of what the consequence. So if the consequence is your career gets slowed down, the consequences. You might not go as far as you were going, as fast as you were going to go. You got to do it anyway, regardless of that. And so I look at it, and just today visually, I think, and what we've heard through the conversations today is a sign of that. I mean, the fact that Stevante is sitting on this stage, went through a transformational policing class with a room full of community members and police officers, not more than a year and a half after he lost his brother. And I guarantee you he's heard some things about himself repeatedly, over and over, from every segment of our community, and he does it anyway. Jamila talked about her. I guarantee you Mayor Rawlings Blake could tell you stories, Jose, Jamal, Larry, and they did it anyway. And so I think we need more people that do that, because if we think we're ever going to get to a point where change is relatively smooth and easy, that will never happen, ever, and we got to do it anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I second that. Because I'm working on a book right now called The Price of the Agenda. And what that means is, what price are you willing to pay for your agenda? If your agenda, see, my brother's legacy is my agenda, but I pay a price for that. The most phone calls I get are for family members that have been affected by gun violence or whatnot. They'll call me and be like, oh, Stevante, how can I get my story out there? Like, I'm like, nah, you don't want that. You don't want that because you got to pay a price for that. I paid a price for it. I went to jail. I went to an institution. The whole world called me crazy. I was kind of ostracized from the community. I got treated worse by black people than anybody, honestly. What the white people were saying to me, I didn't see it up front. Black people come to me in the middle of a restaurant, like, nigga, you crazy. You know what I mean? I'd be like, I'm eating dinner with grandma. You know what I mean? Like, but, you have, if your agenda is like mine is big and you really want to do a lot, you really want to help and you want to, implement change and leave a legacy, because you're in politics, correct? So you want to leave a legacy, you might have to pay a price for that, and it might not, everybody, I don't get that treatment now, but, I went through it, and I made it out okay, and I think we all made it out okay, so, I think it's a lot of, we keep saying hard work, but it's a lot of hard work that has to be put into it, too. The hard work needs to be there. Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jose. Yeah.
Nah, go down there. There you go, brother.
Oh, you're not mic'd up anymore?
You're not mic'd up anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a mute. I just didn't have a microphone. But I really want to
What's
address
your name?
My name's Jose. I'll give you all 5 names. But I really want to address your question, and it actually has something to do with what Jamelia said before, which is about owning your story. One of the things that makes this panel really powerful to me is it's us talking about us. A lot of times the problems that you're talking about get perpetuated because someone else is telling that story. And with technology and with the way we can get access, I encourage you to start telling your story. And to what Stevante said, there's some risks to that. There's some challenges to that. I know Chief Hans had some ups and downs, but he's fought through with that. But I would just strongly encourage that we continue, and Larry's been doing this through the Observer for years, is that we have to start controlling that dialogue about where we are, and it ties back to the economic development question. We have to invest in us. We got to stop that story of taking our funds and leaving our communities. Tell people why it's important to stay in Meadowview, why it's important to stay in Oak Park, why it's important to stay in DPH, whatever the neighborhood might be, so that the West Side reaction is not what the media tells you, it's what you know, what made you a graduate, what made other people resilient and strong. So that would just be my own 2 cents on that.
Let this be the last question. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Mark Baker, and I'm from the west side of Chicago. But I currently live in the city of South Fulton, Georgia. We're Twin City to Atlanta. We're only 2 years new, and I serve as the first councilman of District 7, and I've been the mayor pro tem and vice mayor for the past 2 years there. Over the past 2 years of being an elected official in the city of South Fulton, according to the National League of Cities, we're the blackest city in America because we have over 90% African American population, and we have over 100,000 people, and everything south of I-20 in Atlanta that was unincorporated is our city now. And over the past 2 years, I've decriminalized less than an ounce of marijuana. I've banned a box for convicted felons on applications. I've made $15 a minimum wage as of this October 1st, and some other progressively. We're the only city in the whole state of Georgia, because of my legislation, to abolish Columbus Day for Indigenous People Day, and it's one of those things where the Trail of Tears actually started in Gordon County in Georgia, about 30 miles away from my city, but nobody else in the state out of 348 cities, of course we're the 5th largest, will do that, and I was able to get that passed. My question is, I serve with 7 other people, and I know there's cameras, and I'm okay with it being known, and it's like, what do you do when you have to fight your people to fight for your people? Because all of those positive legislation that you guys applauded for, they didn't all pass unanimously. And for those people who did raise their hand with me, I had to actually really sit down and say, yo, you use CBD oil for your needs. You're 82, I know, and you serve in District 4, and that's how I got one person to vote. And then I have to walk down, your son went to jail for this, and 90% of the people who go to jail look just like you, like your son and me. So we need to change these laws. So when you put it, like Tupac say, politicians are hypocrites, they don't want to listen. Like, people are in the position of making a difference, and then they don't want to listen. So how say you, when you have to fight your people, to fight for your people?
Well, I'll answer that first too, in my opinion. I think the person that answers that question is you. You just answered it. You got it done, right? It passed, right? So I would say this. I think what you did, what it sounds like you did, is you were selfless enough that, like, I'm more committed to the end goal as opposed to who gets credit and who, all that stuff. So you do what you got to do, and you just keep doing it no matter what. There's not a person on this stage that hasn't had to fight their own people continuously to this, but they do it anyway, just like you said you got this stuff done. So at the end, if we don't care who gets credit and we don't care what it takes to get there, but we know the end game is what's going to help the most people, we just got to keep doing it. We have to have more people like you that are willing to do that, regardless of how obviously hard it was. As you just went through that story, you did it anyway.
I appreciate that, and I just wanted to add this one part, though, because I didn't add it, and maybe you could speak to that as well. Yeah, I have that because I was locked up. I had that desire to do the things that I did because I'm a product of the West Side of Chicago. I gangbang. I was a gangster disciple, and I did all of these things. I was locked up 3 times before I was 18 years old. So it's like, I don't have, of course, I went to college, master's, doctorate in African American Studies. I was professor at Clark. And most of those things that give me my drive is because of what I've done. But many of us oftentimes have that illusion of inclusion, and we break our arms patting ourselves on the back. So I think that that's a different caveat to that fight of fighting for your people. It's more like, are they really my people when they don't identify with me culturally or through my experience? And like, how does that fight
those are your
parallel?
people, and the only thing that you described is the legislative process. That's politics. If it's all black people, it's all white people. If it's mixed, that's the process. Doesn't matter. You come to everything with your experiences, with what you know to be true based on who you are and what you've been through, and everybody else that's sitting at the table does the same thing. And the effective politician is the one who is willing to do what you did and to sit down and to be in relationship with people, to not diminish where they come from and what their experience is, but to look for common ground so you can move things forward. So it doesn't, I think, you know, because you're the blackest city, you're fighting against a bunch, you know, you're fighting other black people. There's no homogenous, there's no city council anywhere in the country that's voting on everything unanimously. Doesn't matter if they're white, black, or otherwise. Everybody's bringing their own stuff to the table. Everybody has their own priorities, and leaders figure out how to reach consensus. And the chief was right when he talks about I found that the people who are less interested in credit get the most done. Reach consensus and push things through in mutual respect. So I know it's frustrating because I think my life would be easier if everybody agreed with me. But that's not how it is. You gotta push, you have to do what you're doing and continue to do it, even when it's frustrating, even when you feel like you shouldn't have to explain certain things to certain people because they, you know, look a lot like you. You know that you said it, with the force that you're talking about, your experience, that's where everybody else is bringing that to the table. And it is imperative, if we're going to continue to do this work as African American people, that we understand that like minds can differ and open ourselves up to the possibility that in those differences we can still move forward.
All right. Two things. First, please let's give our panelists a round of applause. They were fantastic. I'm very proud of everyone here on this panel. As the observer of you all, we're in a special city. I love Sacramento. Second thing, can I please, you know, this event again was brought to us by the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce. So, yes, let's give the chamber a round of applause. If you are currently on the board of the Sacramento Black Chamber, or if you've been on the board of the Sacramento Black Chamber, could you please stand up and let everybody acknowledge you and recognize you for your work? Come on, man. Thank you, guys. These we talk about selfless leadership. This is the part of the team that is selfless in the work that they do.
How come Larry didn't stand up?
I had already acknowledged that I was a former board chair. So, but thank you all for coming. And also, this was being streamed, but it will also be available on the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce's website, which is sacblackchamber.org. Got it. All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.